Welcome to another episode of Facts, a special edition episode, as a matter of fact. One of the things we're going to cover today is a history of what happened in England, specifically with Archbishop Augustine of Canterbury. And I brought in a special guest today, Father Steve Macias, and he is in California. I'm going to let you introduce yourself to the crowd. And then also, in addition to that, tell us a little bit about the church where you're working at and how the Lord is working there in your parish.
Well, my name is Father Steve Macias. I'm the rector of St. Paul's Anglican Church here in Los Altos, just about half hour out of San Francisco. I'm also the headmaster of a classical school here, which is called Canterbury School, so appropriately named for today's lesson. Married, my wife Sarah and I just celebrated a dozen years married. We got 4 kids who are all named after really common English names. So you have Athanasius and Basil and Ambrose and Assumpta. So everywhere they go, everything's already pre-written in their names, nameplates and jewelry and things, of course. But glad to be with you here. This is one of my, of course, favorite subjects to talk about because the Pope-splainers love it as well, as we talk about the history of the English church before the adulterous Henry VIII, of course.
Yes, and he will come up because that is, I don't know if anybody knew this or not, but that's the only Anglican history there is. So we're gonna rewind a lot further than King Henry VIII. But you are my hero on the names of your children. I love the name Athanasius. So I named my son after a prophet, Jeremiah, and my daughter Kezia, I named her after Job's daughter. But they were also born before I did history in a deep search way. So I think it's pretty cool that you have a child named Athanasius and you named him after a bunch of other significant individuals. So kudos to you. Kudos to you for that. As it relates to what we're talking about here, the Anglican tradition, the Church of England as a whole, what's faulty is the common belief system that brings us to King Henry VIII. That this is where they begin. There is no, as if there was no church there before. It's a fallacy to land with King Henry VIII. Now, a major shift happened with King Henry VIII wanting to receive the divorce, was denied the divorce. He was a little brash in his disposition and the way that he said he clearly didn't like Luther, but he liked the idea of Reformation enough. But in the the realm of King Henry VIII, it was not the only thing that brought the final break. It was really, I call the final straw that broke the camel's back. It was brewing for years before that move. That move was just the final move. So kind of talk about why it's a fallacy to start Anglican history there, although the term originates itself there. But the history of the church itself, it's not a good place to land.
Well, the history of the Church of England itself even the name doesn't begin with Henry VIII. If you go all the way back to the Magna Carta, that's where we see Anglicana Ecclesia, or Anglican Church, as early as there. The debate typically on names is the Church of England compared to the Church in England. And there is, of course, a historical precedence for there being a Christian church in England dating back to, some would argue, our traditions to the 1st century, that there's a mythology even attaching St. Paul to visiting Britain. But we can talk a little bit about those things. But the big issue is that, first of all, King Henry VIII doesn't do anything novel by putting himself in between the religion of his realm and the Pope. He's actually continuing a long-standing debate of English kings versus the continent, a long-standing debate against the Latinization of the British Isles, a long-standing debate of not just in England, but of churches, national churches, kings, and really individuals all throughout Europe who are fighting against the encroachment of a very ultramontane view of historic Christianity. Henry, it represents a very significant point in history, but he's not the first monarch to come against the Pope, and he's not the first monarch to break relations with the Pope. He's also not the first English monarch to break with this relationship. And so Henry, although he is given this breaking point in history when he and Cranmer break from the church in Rome, there is historical precedence even in Henry's own family for doing so that don't have anything They do not have anything to do with his desire for an annulment from the Pope. Excuse me.
So I think that's a good point that needs to be brought out. You mentioned Cranmer that goes into the massive portion of this. I think that's probably why he gets highlighted, because his break had an actual, I would say, a collective idea and direction attached to it. And Cranmer was probably a big part of that. How much do you think Cranmer played into getting the attention on King Henry VIII? Because he actually started working out the church and what the Church of England is going to be, its organization, its structure, its liturgy. Do you think that had a major playing part into why he gets the attention for the actual break, even though there was other issues in the past?
Right. Well, I think a lot of people view the Reformation in England merely as a religious idea, that somehow Henry wants to assert himself as the head of this doctrine on divorce or a doctrine of annulment, and that he uses as an excuse to change the religious tone of England. But that's a really secondary issue in Henry's early stages. He sends Cranmer to Germany because you can't really understand the Reformation history without recognizing the relationships that existed between the Italian popes, between the monarchs throughout Europe, and of course in Germany, the relationship between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. Because, for example, you have familiar relations between the current Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, and there's a familiar relationship between Catherine of Aragon, who is married to Henry VIII. So for him to ask for an annulment, the issue primarily for the Pope is not, is there religious grounds for the annulment? The primary issue is, if I grant the annulment, how embarrassed will the Catholic region of Spain, called Aragon, be at losing this political point here, and how embarrassed will the Holy Roman Emperor be, and how will that affect the prestige, the income, the wealth, the power of the papacy? So those are really the factors that are going into Henry's mind as well. But the other part of that that's often misunderstood is that the Pope previously, prior to the break, had recognized, as you kind of alluded to, Henry as a great defender of the faith. And he had himself put together a defense of traditional Catholic theology. So Henry himself is also a very knowledgeable man. He's a man of theology. And if you've actually read his defense of his annulment, he goes to Leviticus and defends his case, not because he is looking for a political reason. For Henry, there are some scruples about this issue that's really bothering him and the future of his nation. So there's a whole conflagration of ideas here. But the short version of it is, Henry sends Cranmer to Germany to try to work out a negotiation to make this politically more accessible for the Pope to grant the annulment. And Cranmer basically gets converted into a pre-schism Augustinianism, which we today would call Lutheranism, right? Yes. This idea of the faith before the accretions of the late medieval period that change and introduce indulgences, purgatory, the universal jurisdiction of the Pope, really introducing a syncretistic, semi-Pelagian view of salvation into the church. There's lots of things that this Lutheranism teaches Cranmer, who gets married in Germany, sneaks his wife back to England, and starts this movement with Henry, not to break from the historic church, but to restore the realm of England to its former glory before the medieval period has kind of polluted the church. And this is different, I think, than many of the continental reformers like Calvin. Or even
Zwingli.
Some of Zwingli, right? Who their Reformation was purely the opinion on their particular theological pet issues. Of course, now Calvin, great theologian, but what the meaning of the English Reformation was: can we return the English church to what the kings had previously defended? And they could go back in their history and see how the Pope had interceded into the affairs of the English church and had created a situation at the time of the English Reformation where the Pope was at a status, at a power unrecognizable in the English church 500 years before, 1,000 years before, or at the start of the English church. So the English Reformation is throwing off what made them polluted and restoring what was truly Catholic. And so you have to go back before Henry to understand Henry's motives.
Sure, and I think that's great, and I've said on this program multiple times that Anglicanism is a similar version of what the Roman Church was in that area before the Middle Ages. It's before the adoption of purgatory and indulgences and all those things. It was seeking to reform, not fully away, but to a form that it was before. And Luther attempted to do the same thing, particularly on the Augustinian side of things. But somebody actually, and I'm going to go ahead and pull up a comment here that was in there to answer a question because we're already in it. We might as well. Didn't Henry VIII kill Reformationists? So that's a question from the audience itself. So what say you about King Henry's view of Reformation? He did have some harsh views of Luther. I just read recently where he wrote against Luther on the sacraments. He wrote to the Pope.
Yes, I mean that's what got him the awards. Yeah,
sure.
The accolades.
So I mean, he was pretty harsh, but yeah, I mean, he was a fan, but he wasn't a fan of the Reformation. I mean, he liked elements of it, but not others. So, what do you say to the question?
I mean, it depends on how we define Reformation, because the church is always and perpetually in a state of reformation.
Yes,
just as Calvin is a reformer, the church, even the Roman Church, recognizes its own internal reformers. Saint Francis of Assisi, his primary role is a reformer of the church. These men who we consider great heroes of the church have to risk criticizing the church in order for them to be notable. It's when we go along with the dead church. Now, the difference, I think, in approaching Henry is while the Anglican Church will call Henry the head of the English Church, he doesn't take the same type of role that we would expect of, say, a pope. You know, popes who can speak ex cathedra, popes who have a certain claim for holiness or righteousness, etc. But the Anglican system doesn't depend, so to speak, on the righteousness of Henry. Henry does lots of things that I think were probably politically unwise. Speaking against early Protestant reformers, closing of the monasteries, these different things. But there's a certain definition of Reformation that has to be understood in Henry's own life. Of course, the legacy of Henry is in Cranmer and in the prayer book, in the church itself. And one of the first things that Henry does, which was revolutionary, was having the litany written in English. And just a few centuries earlier, English copies of worship and scripture were outlawed by the Roman Church.
Yes.
Even though in English history itself, King Alfred threw off the Latin and made English the language of the university. So understanding Reformation is, again, a nuanced debate. What was the cause of the Reformation develops throughout the terms of their life, just like Anglican history moves itself from Henry against Luther to Henry now having a Lutheran archbishop, to Henry now chasing the papists out of the monasteries, to now Henry putting forth his articles, to now Henry putting forth the first English litany since the great King Alfred. So he goes from being a criticizer of the Roman Church and a persecutor of the reformers to now being the champion and really a gateway, a bulwark of bringing the church back into reform. Now, you mentioned about kind of bringing the church back from its medieval accretions. And it's hard to put a particular timeline on there because there are great English Christians all the way through that accretion period. And so we're very tempted to throw medieval thinkers out, but the greatest medieval thinker of the Western world happened in Canterbury. St. Anselm, right in the middle of the medieval period, has a lot of things that would be thrown out during the Reformation, but we still welcome him, St. Anselm of Canterbury, as one of our canonized saints. But the big difference, and I think what is helpful in framing this debate, is recognizing the two lungs of the church. If you were to put an arbitrary date on here, say 1054, the great schism between the East and the West.
East and West, yeah.
Right. The church recognizes that something changed in Rome during this period, whether it's exactly 1054 or earlier before. There's debates about that. But the Reformation has basically the same complaint as the Greek and the Antiochian churches 500 years earlier. The Pope is overstepping his boundaries and he's changing something. And it wasn't always like this, and we have the church fathers to prove it. That's the basic bulwark behind the English Reformation, and they're going to go in different directions because there are human people involved in this. But I think that's a helpful discussion, and to recognize that Henry is picking up a couple of pieces. He's picking up his own English history of the church in England since the very beginning. He's picking up his own title as king of this realm, and he's going to work out what that means. And he's also picking up this mantle of reforming the church in the midst of the chaos here in the divided church, East and West. And that's really the context that you need to work back from, rather than the opposite thing, which is what most failed Roman Catholic historians do, and that's assume all of Christian history is Roman Catholic until you get to the Roman to the Reformation, and then suddenly the Church of England is the defector and schismatic. And it's like, that's not the case at all. We've been English and we've been Catholic. Here's where we're reasserting that history in plain sight. So
yeah, I think the narrow-minded view of Rome that all, I mean, we always say all roads lead to Rome, but like all historical roads lead to Rome, so to speak. But we see times very early on, even where North African churches are writing to Rome, concerned about some exercising of power, of expelling people out of the church and things like that, overstepping boundaries. There's no doubt that there was not a first-time thing going on here. There were pre-reformations, as some call it, all through the time of the Middle Ages, coming from different directions, even from, like you mentioned, even previous kings. I mean, schism from the East was massive, and it didn't slow down at all after the 11th century. There was constant debates that continued on. Then everybody just started doing their own thing. So there was major uprise about where does the Pope stand in relation to the universal church, and how does he work in and out of the councils, which is ironic because some of the early councils we see, most of the time, the papacy, the Pope himself did not even show up to many of these councils. He sent delegates, and it was other bishops around the world, like Antioch, like Alexandria, or areas of Byzantium, who were sending their mainline archbishops to these major debates or these major synods. And typically we find some of the major ones, like the Council of Ephesus, for example, the Pope didn't show up. He sent delegates. And the majority of the bishops that were there were not from Rome. There were very few from Rome in these, including Nicaea. So it's an interesting take to think that all historical roads lead to Rome when they actually don't. There's actually a larger view, a bigger view of the apostolic churches beyond Rome. And that's kind of where I want to jump into this before we get into Augustine of Canterbury, is that there were already churches in the British Isles, if you would, that go back to, some say Paul, some say John, the Celtic church specifically to John. You mentioned an idea that there's rumor mill within history of Paul possibly even visiting. So kind of go back to that. And folks that are in the audience, if you want to ask questions or insert some comments, always feel free to do that. But kind of talk about the theory you posed that Paul may have actually visited the area, and where do we get that idea?
Yeah, so the helpful thing here, I mean, we say all roads lead to Rome because in order to understand Christian history, you have to go back a couple hundred years before Christ. You have that famous disciple, Alexander the Great of Macedon, who comes and basically paves the way for a common culture across Europe, Hellenism through Alexander the Great. And then under that kind of comes the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire provides not just an infrastructure, but a common culture from basically North Africa, obviously the areas around Rome, but all the way as far as the British Isles. And famously, our buddy Julius Caesar's campaigns lead all the way out to the British Isles. And so for people who are familiar with the Gospels, of course, recognize Pontius Pilate as a Roman governor. But that also meant that the Roman story, the Roman roads, provided a conduit for the gospel to leave from Jerusalem and have direct trade routes, direct missionary routes, direct civic routes, meaning that a constable in Jerusalem could have direct communications with the governor in the British Isles because they were connected by letters of the Roman Empire. And that kind of connection made it possible for a lot of these, I guess, these stories of how Christianity got to England to be plausible. So the one with St. Paul, I don't know if there's very much merit to it, but it's one that's testified to in some of our late 7th, 8th century kind of looking back. How did Christianity get here? And the idea is that one of St. Paul's missionary journeys goes all the way across into England. The most common one, I think, though, and again, these are kind of hagiographies, is Joseph of Arimathea. And that is the man who was in charge of the burial of Jesus, donating his blood. And there's this idea that he's a trader, he's a wealthy man, and the tin trade goes all the way up to the British Isles. And then Joseph of Arimathea leaves Jerusalem, travels to the British Isles, and plants churches there. And we believe this about other parts of the Apostolic Church. So, for example, down in South India, we have shrines to St. Thomas, because we believe that Thomas left Jerusalem, traveled all the way to India, and established the church there. And all we have is later accounts, 7th, 8th, 12th century legends about this happening. But there's no doubt that Christianity got there, because when we go back to the archaeology, we find these Nestorian-style crosses in the architecture. We find Christians who trace their roots back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. So there's no doubt about St. Thomas. And the same thing's true. For example, St. Mark travels to North Africa. He goes through Egypt. He founds Alexandria. He goes down to Ethiopia. There's no doubt in our minds that the Christianity is there in these regions, because just the next century, we have Christians and bishops pop up in this area. Now, it's a problem when we get to Britain, because Britain has so much at stake for the Roman claim of papal supremacy. So if they can undermine the claim of an independent Celtic church or an autocephalous Celtic church, then we have to default to a papal supremacy theory. But there are, of course, behind that, lots of hagiographies that go to the early church. And I can see Father Brett on here.
Do you know Father Brett Murphy?
Yeah. So he's Free Church is our. I'm a presbyter in the Reformed Episcopal Church. That's our sister group across the pond.
Church of England. He's been on the program. We actually did the rise and fall of the Church of England together, maybe month, 2 ago. So he's been on here as well. He makes the comment the Eastern Church venerates Saint Aristobulus, apostle of Britain, who allegedly arrived in Britain in 52 AD and was martyred in the British Isles. He almost totally forgotten by Western churches. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah. Well, this is, of course, there's historic precedence for this. And when we go into the churches, and we're going to have to go in a little bit here, because the English church itself is not one monolithic church. And if we were to have a map in front of us, we could show you how it's very divided into different parts. But when we get to Augustine, we're going to talk about what the Roman church changes about English history as well. For example, there's an account where Augustine gets to one of the shrines of a local shrine of Saint Sixtus. And Saint Sixtus, of course, there's later Pope Saint Sixtus and Saint Sixtus II. But this was a local shrine of a pre-Romano-British bishop or saint. And Augustine demands that they take down the shrine, because this is a pre-Roman shrine, and rededicate it to somebody else. And so I think this is in Bede's record, there's a record of them coming and seeing, oh, you have a local cult to, this local Saint Sixtus. Well, that's not part of the Roman pantheon of saints, pantheon being using disparagingly, I'm sorry. But there's this local Saint Sixtus. You can't do that. Even though that's your British tradition, we're going to change that, and we're going to put the Latin version on top of that. So when we look at the break between the 7th century going forward, how often did the Roman Church impose that upon them? We don't know. And so the Eastern Church venerates Aristobulus, and there's also just a historical record of the bishops who participated in the Synod of Arles. Because if you imagine, you have the British Isles here, across there, very significant Archbishop of Arles. So basically the Gaelic Church, not to be confused with the language they speak in the British Isles, but Gaelic referring to the Gauls. But the Gaelic Church had an Archbishop, which was given the pallium by the Pope, very influential, very important and significant. And there were recorded throughout our historical synods before even Nicaea, these bishops representing York, representing Londonium, London, right, who came over and participated in these basically what we call French today, but historical Gaul-ish councils. So if there were bishops early on participating in these French councils, well, we should recognize that there was a historic church with it. So there has to be a historic lineage to that. There has to be a founder of that came before these councils. And so it completely comports with the history that we have in Nicaea, post-Nicaea, leading up to Bede, that there would be a Saint Aristobulus, even if we don't have a body to match it. There has to be some version of him that first came to England. And the record, the testimony of the church is that this happened as early as 1st or 2nd century. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And to me, that's it. And Brett goes on to, Father Brett actually puts in an additional there. He says, interestingly enough, Aristobulus was mentioned at the end of the Epistle of St. Paul's to the Romans. Legend has it he was one of the 72 disciples sent out by Jesus, which is recorded by Luke's gospel. But when you look at the connection there, and I'm glad you brought Gaul up into this, because I think that there actually is some sort of connection that goes back there. And some would venture to say that perhaps that succession line of churches goes back to St. John in the area, particularly because of Irenaeus, who was in Lyon. So how much credibility? So you have ideas of Paul. Some of the Celtic churches go into saying perhaps John the Apostle had sent individuals, missionaries that way. I mean, is there any credibility to perhaps Johanan influence?
I'd say we can have certainty that there is Johanan influence.
Wow.
And the certainty is actually, you can reverse engineer this. So first of all, if we go into, obviously, John's liturgy, the liturgy of St. John is one of the important apostolic liturgies, right? We have liturgy of St. Mark, liturgy of St. John, and there's distinctives about those. And not just in the words that they said that we see in the patristic liturgies that are passed on, basically from Hippolytus down, but also in the way in which they did certain rituals. And you'll see this later on in the debates at Whitby, in different synods, in regionals, that the differences between the Roman Church and the Celtic churches are significant differences between the Roman tradition and the Johanan tradition. So when we get to the debate about the date of Easter, the reason why they refused to change it is because they said, we have the date of Easter from St. John. Who is a greater authority than John? How can we change that? And then penitentials are, of course, how you assign penance for different things. These were done publicly in the Roman Church. So you have to make basically, you get sent back to being a catechumen if you do a heinous sin, and you have to stand before the public church to do a reconciliation. Well, when the church in Ireland, the church in Northumbria, when it comes into interaction with Augustine's Roman priests, they notice that there's differences in their practices on these penitentials because they had followed this earlier Johannine tradition where that was done privately through a spiritual elder, kind of like a private confession, whereas the other one was a Roman tradition. So not only that, but even during the Reformation, the arguments made about changes to the Roman canon and the development of the Book of Common Prayer was that the Sarum history was always pointing towards our influence from St. John's liturgy as opposed to the liturgy that came from Rome. And so certainly the English church traces its roots back through St. John, and there's obviously an interaction between Gaul and England because they touch, basically. But that's also the source of consternation over the years, right? So if you go backwards and from today through English history, there's this French-English conflict that doesn't start because the French are losers in the Second World War or something like that. Not that that's true, but that this French or this Norman or this Gaulish conflict repeats itself over and over in English history. And so you'll see that over and over again. And especially you'll see that in the life of St. Augustine, that Gaul plays an integral role in the establishment of the beachhead at Kent against the Celtic churches in Northumbria and Ireland. But we can get into that however you want.
It's interesting how Augustine comes on the scene at the end of the 6th century. So the Pope is the one that actually issues the mission groups to go there. They get there, and there's actually rumors about the Anglo-Saxons, particularly what they would run into. Augustine actually sends messages back to the Pope saying it's not as bad as people think. So kind of
Yes.
talk about that. So Augustine's sent on a mission. He's got these mission works and orders from the Pope himself. Because I mean, so Augustine's one of my people. He's
Yeah.
Italian.
Well,
So you know, he's heading. We're Italian on my side, my mom's side of the family. So he's heading. He's got these missionaries. There's rumors about the Anglo-Saxons. He goes and says, actually, the rumors are a little bit exaggerated. So kind of talk about the framework of the land by the time
yeah.
he gets there. It's not what Rome expected.
So here's a little. I think you have to go back to 400 or so, because that's about 407 is when Rome officially kind of evacuates from the British Isles, and so they pull out all of their basically government officials. They pull out all of their people of status who lived in the British Isles, and in that vacuum, you see the Saxon people invade over the English Channel. And these people who come into basically what today we would describe, as Kent, or the southeastern England. If you imagine the map, and right, the southern part, not where Wales is, the other coast. If you imagine this part is invaded by the Saxons, and the merge of these two cultures of the native British people and the Saxon or Germanic people who come in creates what we today would call Anglo-Saxon. But it only did this lower part of the kingdom comes under the Anglo-Saxons. And so at this time in history, 500, 600, there's something called the heptarchy in the various kingdoms of England. So all the way up at the top, you have Northumbria, and then you come down to Mercia, you have Essex, Wessex, Sussex, and then the closest part to obviously the French part is Kent. Kent's the most southeastern part of here. And obviously I forgot East Anglia is just north of there. But basically these 7 kingdoms all represent 7 tiny countries inside of these Celtic areas. And all of them represented very different religious ideas, but it was only the southeastern region that had really come under Anglo-Saxon conquest and had merged in this culture, and had where Christianity has basically lost its foothold. The Anglo-Saxon culture had pushed Christianity out, but Christianity was still strong here in the 7th century in Ireland, in Northumbria. There were Christians elsewhere beyond this major area here. And this is often forgotten because we tend to think of England as like a single country, which is unfortunately what the Venerable Bede, who was sainted by, I think, Leo XIII in the 19th century. But Saint Bede later wants you to think of England as one people because it fits his telling of the story of Saint Augustine. But if you understand the heptarchy and that there's a divided kingdom and that the Anglo-Saxons represent, this non-Christian kingdom, that is a different context than all of England is, or all of the British Isles are lost. Because at the same time that this is happening, you have just before this St. Patrick bringing Christianity from Northumbria to Ireland, and that has to happen from a place of faith to faith. And you also have, of course, Columba, Columbanus, all these guys. There are strong monastic footholds all throughout the British Isles. The faith hasn't disappeared. In fact, when we'll see later in the story, there are dozens and dozens of bishops representing lots of dioceses all throughout this area that is supposedly not Christian, which, as we know, doesn't make sense historically.
Is that why perhaps Augustine was surprised when he got there? Because for some reason, Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the Great, was under because of that disconnect of about 150 years or so, 150 years, he was under the impression, I guess he believed the whole area had just become completely paganized. I think he was shocked to get the report that he did from Augustine, because Augustine said, your fears are basically groundless. Like you grounded yourself. It's not what you think. What was the big surprise? Because apparently there was a perception in Gregory's mind when he didn't send Augustine there without reason, right?
Right. So I think it's easy to understand what they thought was going to happen. Imagine if today, United States government collapses and everybody secedes into their own little regions and states. Well, anybody who comes to visit is going to expect anarchy. And that's basically what happened in Celtic Britain. Rome pulls out and the pagan Saxons invade. But if you're a Roman, you're thinking they're no longer cultured, they're no longer civilized, they're Saxon people, they're no longer Roman people. So that part is there. But there's also, and again, this is quoting Bede, there's also a little mythology story about Gregory and the Saxon people. I'm sure you've heard the story about the Angles and Angels, of course.
Yes.
Maybe I should repeat it for us. But
go for it for the audience, especially.
So Pope Saint Gregory, which is a man that should be respected and honored by all Protestants everywhere. John Calvin himself said Gregory was the last great pope. So that's an important thing to recognize. Gregory, brilliant man, brilliant administrator, wonderful theologian. He wrote a pastoral guide that was given to lots of priests. And basically, the structure of the Western Church and the success of the Western Church is built upon his leadership and also his sacramentary, where he puts the books together and Latinizes a lot of things. But Gregory is a significant leader in that respect. But he's walking around an Italian market, and he was a monk, by the way. I think he was in the monastery of St. Andrew. But he happens upon some slaves being sold. And he notices one of the slaves has blue eyes, and blonde hair. And he asks the slave merchant, says, "Where are these people from?" And he says, "Oh, they're from they're Angles. They're Angles. They're from Britain." And he knows what Britain is. And he says, "Are there more of them with blue eyes and blonde hair back in Britain?" And the slaveholder says, "Of course, there's a whole nation of them." And St. Gregory says, what's recorded in Bede, Angles, more like angels, right? And so that inspires the idea that he's going to go to these people and be missionaries to the angel people, the Angle people, Anglo-Saxon, Angle, of course, being the Angle part of that. And so he picks one of his old study buddies. So Augustine, this is how he enters the story. Augustine is handpicked as one of his fellow monks that he served with. Now that Gregory's pope, he picks Augustine. They get together a team of fellow Benedictine monks.
I think it was about 40, right? I think it was about 40 of them that were sent.
Yeah, that's about how many you need to conquer a nation, right? I think that's about as many as we need to conquer. No, but
might need more.
But they get them together and they send them over to the British Isles. And there's lots of fun things there, but there's another communication, and this is another reason, perhaps, why Gregory sends the mission at this time. But there are two regions in the southern kingdom of Kent. There's Ethelbert and his wife Bertha, and so Ethelbert is this pagan, Anglo-Saxon Kentish king. So of the heptarchy, of the 7 kingdoms of the British Isles, he's the king of the southeastern one. And he's married a Frankish princess who happens to be Christian, Bertha.
She's Christian, right.
Yeah, so she's from the continent. And so this is a great political merger for Mr. Ethelbert. He's surrounded by 6 other kingdoms that are Christian, by the way, right? Surrounded by 6 other kingdoms that are Christian with bishops. And he happens to marry a Christian from across, a Frankish Christian woman. And there's a little bit of mythology, hagiography, that she gets a letter to St. Gregory asking him, send some missionaries to convert my husband. And so between these two stories, somehow Gregory gets it in his mind that he has to convert the Angles, or the people. So Augustine and his monks, and you can stop me whenever you want to, but Augustine and his monks get in the boat and they go all the way to Kent, cross there, and they stop on an island across from Kent, just out there on the coast. And they come out to meet the king, and he is willing to listen to them preach as long as they preach outdoors. And this is helpful because it tells you what kind of person Ethelbert is. He's afraid that if if Augustine and the monks come into his house, they can do some kind of witchcraft and trick him into becoming a Christian.
Yeah.
Yes. But the long story short, Augustine preaches. Ethelbert eventually comes around, converts. He baptizes him, and Ethelbert allows Christianity to be established in the region of Kent, as long as it's not enforced upon people. No one's mandated to be baptized. And there's also an important thing here to recognize just in studying feudal history. Many of us kind of don't understand how the political and the religious were connected at this time, but whatever the regent's religion was had a huge influence on the general cult of the people. Kind of like when Constantine was converted, first he institutes tolerance, and then basically the entire system is Christianized and bishops are put in the place of judges, etc. So the same thing happens in Kent. They establish the cathedral there, and now we call this Canterbury or Kent Borough or Cantuar Borough, Canterbury. And this becomes the beachhead for the Roman mission in the British Isles. And very quickly after Augustine establishes bishops in this area with the permission of the Pope. And they begin to recognize as they spread out from Kent that they're running into other Christians and other bishops. And
now
so
let's pause there. Pause there. So let's get a timeline here. So Ethelbert gets converted. He's baptized. I believe it was on a Pentecost Sunday, according to tradition, right at around 597. So he's now granted, like you said, permission for Augustine to continue to have churches, but it was not an enforced thing. Now, this time, after he's consecrated into these positions, one of the things that Augustine wanted to do was reconcile the Anglo-Saxon Christians with the others within the British Isles. And he didn't find much success doing that originally. He actually was opposed pretty early on, was he not?
Well, there's a couple of spots here. I think I've ran over a couple of them. So Arles comes into play here as well. So Augustine gets to Kent. He has success converting the king, gets toleration of Christianity in the kingdom of Kent. But then he leaves and he goes back to Gaul. And there he is consecrated
in France. That's right.
In France. Right. Yes. So he's consecrated and he gets a special tool that I think is significant here as we talk about church history. In Gaul, he is given the pallium. And so the pallium is a tool awarded by the bishop. It's a special type of clerical garb that says that you are now in charge of a region. Usually the pallium is reserved for like metropolitans, and the Pope gives this pallium to Augustine with the idea that he cannot have authority over Gaul, who ordained him or who consecrated him. He'll have no authority over Gaul, Gregory says specifically, but Gregory claims for Rome all of the British Isles. So he gives him the pallium as a symbol of that authority, that he's going to be not just a bishop of Kent and this small region, but with this symbolism, with this investiture, Gregory has told Augustine, now your job is to go into Britain and to rule over not just the monks you have established, and I think he establishes initially 12 bishoprics, but also you're going to expand and have authority over those other bishops that already exist there. And so this is the source of the conflict that we're going to see between the Celtic churches, those other 6 kingdoms outside of Kent, who have historical precedents going all the way back to, as we see, the liturgies of St. John, perhaps even the pedigree of St. Paul, even the personages of Joseph of Arimathea. So they have a historic pedigree, and here comes directly in conflict Augustine of Canterbury saying, basically, I'm the Archbishop of the British Isles. I know I've just showed up, but look at my pallium.
Would you say that Pope Gregory overstepped when he did that? Like, would you say it's fair to say that he overstepped in doing that? Because these churches had already seen themselves as apostolic churches, whether it be from John, whether it be from Paul. They already had legit bishops who were doing valid orders. So it seems like, again, Rome's coming in saying, but you need the See of Rome to sanction what you're doing here, which they did in a sense. So it's kind of like there was trying to be a marriage here, and I think it was a forced marriage. You have Peter's church, Paul's church, John's church, which I always found interesting in the Anglican tradition. It's always been said, oh, well, they're a part of Peter's succession. Kinda. I don't think that's actually fair. I think it's a marriage of a lot of the apostles' churches that made its way uniquely over there. In fact, there's even lines of James from Jerusalem going to the British
Mhm.
Isles. So
Mm.
it seems like
Well,
it was a good idea, but maybe not the best way to go about it.
well, here's how Bede. So, the ecclesiastical history of Bede is written a little bit after this, and Bede is trying to justify a lot of the. He's basically an apologist for Rome's later claims, but I think we're guilty of some anachronistic comparisons when we look at this history, because we tend to think that there was already a competing claim when Gregory says, go do this, now go do this, as though Gregory understood himself as having some universal jurisdiction, and now he was going to press it upon the British Isles. That's not how it was understood. Gregory didn't understand himself to be some supreme pope over the world. Instead, what Bede explains is that the reason why Gregory is being so forceful with sending Augustine out is because he is being told by Augustine that the Celtic Christians are refusing to evangelize the Saxons, that they're so caught up in their own kingdoms that Gregory's coming in to do what the other churches refuse to do. And so he is coming in to do what needs to be done, not to impress himself down as like a pope over this region or to
Would you even
reassert
say
his authority.
would you say that's a fair report from Augustine, given the fact that out of the seven, six of those were Christianized areas of the
Well,
Anglo-Saxons? I mean, it's kind of, I think there's a lot of partial truths mixed with
yeah.
exaggerations, it seems
Well,
like.
I think when studying historical theology, as I mean, you've done this in the first several centuries, it's never two-sided, right? It's never just like this was the Romans were right and the Celtics were wrong, right? It's not like that. Just like we make it really simple when we go to Nicaea. It's like, well, there was the Arians and there were the Orthodox, right? We make it these two-sided issues. It wasn't quite that cut and dry, but to be helpful here, we need to remove some of our historical prejudices about how the ancient church viewed the Pope. So, for example, prior to Augustine, about a century prior, there was a missionary in North British Isles. His name was Columbanus, and he was part of these Celtic churches, and he regularly criticized the Pope. There was this idea that the Bishop of Rome, his authority is as good as what he says. So when the Bishop of Rome speaks something that comports with the truth, it's authoritative. But when he is overstepping his boundaries, he can be freely ignored. And so you'll see this even in the Irish church, the one that's famous for St. Patrick, that when they disagreed with something that came from Rome, they just ignored it. And so this is how we end up by the time we get to Augustine versus the Celtic Church. The popes had been sending instructions about this is how we do things, and this is the way you should dress, and this is the way you should celebrate the calendar. But the Celtic Church didn't have this view that the Pope had the authority over the whole church. And so it wasn't rebellious for them to ignore them. They just said, well, we have our tradition, you have your tradition, and we're both Christians. We both hold to the essentials, but we have these distinctives, and it's not the role of the Pope to make everybody the same. So if you have that perspective that it's okay to disagree with the Pope and still be in part of the Catholic Church, I think that makes it a little easier, more palatable to understand the conflict between Augustine and the
Yeah,
Celts.
I wish people would look at it that way today. It seems like you said, there's so much presuppositional thought about how we view things today and the tension and post 11th century and post Reformation. There's so much drama and friction between the churches that it's easy to read that friction into the 7th and 6th centuries, where it was probably not the way that we're viewing it there. And I think that's fair. But nonetheless, so picking up back where Augustine is now trying to bring everybody together, it didn't happen probably the way he wanted it. In fact, he died not long after many of his attempts. But his see, the See of Canterbury, would you say is a valid, this is a good starting point for something?
Mhm.
I think it's a bad idea to say this is where Anglicanism started, and that's why we put a question mark at the beginnings of the Church of England. because you have now two fallacies. The Church of England began through Anglicanism of King Henry VIII. We've already talked about why that's not the case. The next line is that, well, there's a sanctioning, there's a commissioning that happened from Pope Gregory in the 6th and 7th century through Augustine of Canterbury. So we're also saying there, well, there needs to be an asterisk after that to talk about how there were so many churches already there before he got there. There was already succession bishops practicing the Eucharist, practicing traditions of Johanan liturgy already in the area. And no doubt there was probably Roman influence in the area too, in addition to all that. So you have multiple influences in the area. So what makes Augustine a valid, I want to call him a landmark, where we can put a stake in the ground and say, okay, just like King Henry VIII, there's a major stake in the ground. This is a parameter that we can go back to, and we can say, this is what happened. Why is Augustine of Canterbury important, even if he's not the first to bring Christianity there or apostolic Christianity there? He is sanctioned by Pope Gregory, and that's not a small thing. That is a big deal. So why is it important that he is establishing the See of Canterbury so much? Why is he getting the emphasis?
Right. So, I did a video a couple of years ago called "The Anglican Church Before It Was Roman," and what was surprising, what came out of that was a lot of Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Greeks, Russians, Antiochians who've reached out to me and have said something similar to what our father from the Free Church of England said, that this is how the Orthodox view the Anglican Church prior to all of the innovations of women priests and whatnot. That there was a British Orthodox Church that was kind of supplanted by Rome, but the thing that happens that changes the history of the English people is, of course, the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons onto the continent. And so what if we have the best and most charitable reading of Gregory on this is that Gregory, as the Pope, is going to save this kingdom of Kent from its pagan ruler, from its pagan influence, its pagan culture, and going to restore it. And he's going to lend support to that effort, which is what we hope the popes would do in the Western churches, where they are considered to be first among equals, where they are considered to be the fathers of the Western churches. Because we're Anglicans and we're historically knowledgeable of what happened in the Nicene councils, we recognize that there's a pentarchy, of which Rome is first. We recognize that as Western Christians, that we have a special reverence to the Holy Father in Rome, that particular lineage is the source of many of our churches, just as the Alexandrian churches would go to St. Mark, or the Antiochian churches would go to St. John, et cetera, or even St. Peter. But what is the great significant part about Gregory sending Augustine is he lends strength to the English church at a time when pagans are running half the country, right, or a part of the country, and gives them support. Yeah, and what he offers them is, again, a lifeline back to the continent that had been lost when the Romans, not the Roman Catholics, but when the Romans left in the 400s. So reintroducing English, who basically had been separated and then attacked by the Anglo-Saxons, Gregory represents what Christendom should do. When another branch of Christendom is under peril, we send in bishops and we help build up that local church. And the goal of any Christian missionary group has always been to create autocephalous jurisdictions that are governed by indigenous peoples, right? So when Augustine retires, he passes down he passes down the mantle to St. Lawrence, right? So there's an idea, there's an idea of succession going through here. But now what we see after him, and I don't know how deep you want to get into this, but we have the Synod of Whitby, where the conflict of the Celtic and Romano traditions come into the forefront of our ideas. And we often think of the Synod of Whitby, the Celtic versus Roman, as the only place this discussion was had. But this was a debate that's been debated for several hundred years at this point, and it represented the lack of cohesion that existed on the church calendar amongst the different national churches. But to put it in a modern context, because it's really right now just a matter of historical debate, think of how Rome treats some of its uniate churches, right? So you're familiar, of course, with the Greek Catholics or the Ruthenians or the Melkites. So, for example, the Melkites came in to the Roman Catholic Church in the late 19th century. They were part of the Church of Antioch. The Muslims came in, clobbered them, and after the restoration of the Antiochian Church, there was a split. Some of them remained Antiochian. The ones who felt that it hadn't been done correctly joined the Roman Catholic Church. They were called Melkite Christians. And the Roman Catholic Church welcomed them into the communion of Roman churches, but allowed them to keep all of their Antiochian traditions. So their vestments stayed the same, their calendar stayed the same. Even at the First Vatican Council, where the Melkite bishop comes, he signs the Vatican Council, says, except for the rights and privileges reserved to the Eastern Patriarchs, which is basically what the bishops at the Synod of Whitby, the British bishops, wanted to do. But later these Roman bishops are imposing their order, instruction, rule over the British at the exclusion of their own British ancestry. And that's going to come up as we look deeper into English history or British history, that's the conflict that rises up again and again. So, of course, the Great Battle of Hastings, when finally the Normans, the same folks who gave Augustine the pallium through the Pope, they're later going to come and impose upon the British Church the Latin language. They're going to impose upon the English Church the Latin structure of diocese. They're going to impose upon the Latin Church their own rule for how to manage their bishops and things like that. So culture is going to be forced upon the English culture. And there are still some vestiges, like popular culture, in the English language itself. Like there are things in English culture that are connected to the same discussion that you would think have nothing to do with it. So, for example, we have Anglo-Saxon words like cow, right? But when you buy it at the market, it's called beef. It's this Norman French identity. The same thing, we have pigs and pork. All of these strange combinations of Anglo-Saxon etymological history of the culture, along with this Norman or Latinization of the country, that undergirds all of these theological debates. And so it's not so much of the Pope demand universal supremacy. He came to England. They didn't bow their head, and so therefore the Pope was forced to change them. No, there's this natural mixture of the continental Latin Western Church with the English Church, and sometimes the Pope overstepped his boundaries, and the Roman Church, as it was rising with what we would today describe as ultramontane beliefs, right, that the Roman bishop has more power than he traditionally did. English history was the consequence of it.
I think this is an important thing that is missed in modern debate. Rome didn't make the Church of England. It didn't create it. Because let's bring succession into this, for example. Rome does not see Anglican rites as valid. Their bishops, etc. Now, we've shot ourselves in the foot with some of this by ordaining women into priesthood and bishopric in the Church of England, so to speak. But when it comes to the split between King Henry VIII, the thing that is stated most definitely on this very program and multiple times is that's where the Anglicans lost their validity and their ordinations. But if what we're saying here is actually the true portrayal of history, Rome sanctioning or not sanctioning has nothing to do with valid rights. The Church of England goes deeper earlier than Rome and even Gregory. Gregory was not there to enforce Roman rights onto these individuals, these different towns and cities. They already had Christians. They already had liturgy. They already had succession lines. They already had valid bishopric. This isn't an issue of that. So where does this play into the succession? Because at the end of the day, Rome doesn't see the rights of England as valid because of the break between King Henry VIII. But Isn't that faulty when you look at the whole history here and you actually have the whole context behind Augustine of Canterbury?
Yes. And at the time of Augustine of Canterbury, nobody would be familiar with the common tropes we hear today about the succession of Rome is based on the scripture proofs of upon this rock, Peter. Those weren't even believed at that time or taught at that time. Those are later accretions in the church to defend their later views. But it's important to recognize, you have Augustine, you have the churches in the Celtic lands. But at the Synod of Whitby, the resolution was that they were going to adopt the Roman calendar, adopt the Roman tonsure, but they didn't abdicate their British bishoprics. In fact, what they did was combine the lines. So here, even at this conflict, it's not as though Rome came in and saw a church that wasn't valid, that had to be infused with Roman lines in order for it to be valid. They recognized the existing bishops as completely valid, as orthodox, as apostolic, and they co-consecrated future generations so that they would have both the British and the Roman lines. Now, imagine if that tried to transpire today. Imagine if Pope Francis called up Justin Welby and said, "Hey, we need a new bishop in South America. Will you come lay hands with me?" Right? Most of the Catholics wouldn't recognize Francis, and most of the Anglicans wouldn't recognize Justin, right? Not at all. But that was the sentiment here. It was that we recognize and to borrow a modern term, an Aboriginal Celtic church. But then the claims at the Reformation about the validity of Anglican orders are not even related to Henry, right? So everybody recognizes that the bishops in 1548 are the same bishops in 1549. And nothing's changed. They still have the same consecrators, even though the church has been separated from the Pope. They're still validly ordained bishops. And so there's no question about the licit and valid order of their bishops. The response of the Anglican Church to basically the Catholic call utterly null and void has always been that if Roman Church canons were applied consistently, meaning if they applied the same standard to Anglican orders about sacrificial priesthood, the intention, investiture of bishops, to their own history, then there are no bishops in the Roman Church either. So if anything, the Celtic Church has a stronger claim for apostolic lineage because it has both. It has a pre-Roman line and it has a post-Roman line infused together uniquely. You can't say that about the church in Italy. You can't say that about many of the other churches who just are connected to Peter. The Celtic churches are doubly infused, and we have a twofold history of we have the greatest pope of the first millennia as our father in the 7th century, but we also have the apostolic authority brought to the Isles in the first few centuries, and there's no doubt on the history of those things. The only historical debate now is the post-schism claim of the Ultramontane Tridentine Church valid historically onto the claims of the Reformation Church? And I'd say no, absolutely not.
So my theory, I say all the time jokingly that the Anglicans have a double portion. We have John and Peter, and it's great.
Yeah.
So, and possibly even Paul and James. So let's just bring the whole 12 in, But no, it speaks volumes to me, a little pious idea that, again, all roads lead to Rome historically, meaning only valid orders can be given from the See of Rome. When we know the apostles started churches beyond Rome. I mean, like you mentioned, the Antiochian church, St. Mark was sent down to Alexandria. Thomas went far, far east. I mean, we see this, Andrew, in the areas of Constantinople. I mean, this is the thing. Like, there were other valid churches beyond Peter.
Yes.
Although Peter is, and there's no doubt in my mind, even studying in the 2nd and 3rd century, there was a reverence by the other churches for the Bishop of Rome. That there was always a, what does he think? What does Rome say? Even North Africa, always seen Rome kind of as a mother church that if they needed advice, they'd write letters. You find the councils of Carthage and the Council of Hippo writing letters back and forth to Rome. hey, we're receiving weird letters with apostles' names on them. What's your count? What do you have? Yeah, we got 27 New Testament books. Yeah, I mean, you end up finding like these canonical comparisons in the 5th century.
Yeah.
So there was always a reverence for the See of Rome. Um, but Rome didn't seem, I mean, when you come in, like I mentioned before, the Council of Ephesus, when they're dealing with issues on how do we look at Jesus as, 100% God, 100% man, the Theotokos, you're starting to get in that. Rome didn't show up and say, all right, this is what the Pope says. It's over. This debate ends today. Most of them were North African and Eastern churches dealing with the issue. A few delegates come in and say what the Pope thinks because they want to know what the papacy has to say on the matter, and it's taken into account. In fact, in that council, the Council of Ephesus, you find that the Pope wanted Pelagianism to be revisited and banished, and you find that he wants them to try to reconcile the date of Easter between the East and the West, and they did not come to an agreement on that. So we look in these councils where the Pope wants to see things happen, but it doesn't just happen because the See of Peter says so. But we do see a high value of the See of Peter's successors and what they have to say on any matter. And I think that's probably the most consistent history, even to the point where we're at with Augustine. Gregory's not enforcing himself. He's not being a dictator here. What he's doing is he's trying to help a people who are in despair. There's a dispersion of churches that they may have had liturgy and stuff, but there was a major disconnect between them. He did seek unity on the British Isles to bring these different churches together. And I would say that Augustine started the process of a good thing. I don't think he ever lived to see the full effect of it. He died not long after, I believe. But he wanted to bring these churches together. I think he failed originally. But eventually it did happen. It did kind of happen where there was a marriage between these churches.
Yes. But there's also a sense in which what Augustine is encountering in the British Isles is not unlike what previous popes had faced, as you point out to in previous councils. So anybody who's, of course, familiar with Theodore Mospuesta, right? Mospuesta. I'm given a Spanish accent for some reason. I'm sorry, but he between the 4th and the 5th ecumenical councils, there's this debate over the Theodore is exonerated by the 4th council, but then the Pope goes on and excommunicates. And you can have popes who disagree with councils, and you do in the first few centuries of popes who disagree with the rulings of councils, but what's often overlooked in that discussion is that you had churches in Southern Gaul, in North Africa, who actually withdrew from communion with the Pope during that time. And so one of the kind of principles that were given in the British church is what happens when you have a church that's kind of separated from full communion with Rome. Is that church still alive, or is that separating kill it off because it's only connected by the vine to the root of Rome? And what Augustine gives us is the knowledge that Rome historically has recognized that even churches that were separated by time, history, and space from the See of Rome were still valid and licit and alive and growing, and that when Rome came in, they didn't give new life. They joined in with the life that already existed in these autocephalous churches. So the ecclesiology of the Celtic Church, I mean, I think a lot has been written about the differences, and there's some kind of proto-Protestantism in the Celtic Church. That's not the case. What the significance of the Celtic Church and its role in ecclesiastical history is it gives us the understanding of ecclesiology in these first 6, 7, 8 centuries of the church. That says, just as St. Ignatius had posited centuries before, that the bishop is the smallest unit of the church, and wherever there's a validly ordained bishop who is orthodox, remember, apostolic succession is not just magic hands laid on you, it's orthodoxy as well. But anywhere the bishop is, the fullness of the church is there. And so whether it was in Northumbria or in Ireland, it didn't depend on their allegiance to whoever the Pope happened to be in Rome. It depended on their fidelity to the Scripture and to the Christ who is professed in that Scripture. And so, if Augustine, sent by the Pope directly, can recognize the Celtic Church, this is the same case that Henry is making, that this church and its origin, its authority, is ancient as well. And I think that's probably hard for our Roman friends to accept, who have been living in a post-Trent world.
Well, and that's understandable. How do you believe Cranmer looked back? How often did he recognize the things you're talking about? Did he often go back to the Celtic church that was there? Did he mention Augustine quite a bit when he talked? Because they can't just break from Rome without having deep-rooted reasoning that goes beyond their lifetime. There's no doubt that King Henry did. How much did Cranmer? I know he went to Germany. I know he was kind of influenced by Lutheran ideas, but he seems to have the concept of going back to an earlier root than Roman and Latin. Because, I mean, at this point in this time, we have to remember in history, Latin Mass was pretty much it. And this was the issue with a lot of the English speaking people at that time is, I mean, this is where Tyndale comes in. I mean, this is people wanted Wycliffe is the morning star of the Reformation, right? I mean, he took what he could. He took Latin and turned it into English. And I mean, Tyndale does beyond his years by himself without a committee, one of the most extraordinary works that influenced greatly even the King James translators in 1604 and beyond. So you have major impact in the English side of things here when they're looking at the Church of Rome. Was Cranmer seeking to go deeper into the history of the Anglican tradition that went beyond Augustine? Did he see himself as scripting something not new, but old that even goes back to the Celtic tradition? Did Cranmer feel like he was doing that when he was kind of paving the way in the new formation?
I can't cite a quote that says Cranmer was looking to Columbanus or St. Patrick or Bede or something like that. But I think we can read from the type of reform he did do, how he viewed the ecclesiology of the church. You notice that the Lutherans on the continent, the folks in Geneva, all of them were able to basically move beyond the episcopacy. But Calvin kept the episcopacy, not just because it was convenient, but because he recognizes the historic necessity of it, and he keeps that order in the prayer book. Cranmer not only maintains the episcopacy, but the Book of Common Prayer itself maintains the monastic identity that was unique to the Celtic Christians. He recognized that there was a connection between the monastic identity of basically the Benedictine school that had come up through the Irish, come up through Northumbria, come up through Columba, and that was the source of the strength of the English church, and that was what was going to be the primordial part of the English reform. It's monastic identity in the prayer book and the episcopal orders. That's unique to the Anglican Reformation compared to what happened in the Netherlands, compared to what happened in the other parts of the continent, and that only works for somebody who refuses to ignore their history, right? There was lots of pressure on Cranmer, and you saw this later in 1646 in the English Church in general, when basically bishops are repealed. There was lots of pressure in Cranmer's time from men like Butzer, who were pushing towards more and more reform. So how does he hold his ground? Well, there's a history to the English episcopate. There's a history to our succession of bishops, and that goes back not just to his own seat, which goes all the way back to Augustine, but through the various seats of Londonium, the seats of York. These go back to a pre-Roman church. And I can't imagine that Cranmer would be willing to give up that heritage in particular. But there's another part of this that is not specifically in relation to episcopal polity, and that is the political sentiment of it. In recent scholarship, when we talk about American founding fathers, there's a sense in which they saw themselves as Saxon men, the American founding fathers, Saxon men throwing off the Norman conquest of England. So the American Revolution was this repeating of historical trends. I think Cranmer would have seen something very similar in his reform, that elevating the King of England as the head of the realm again was taking back what the Norman bishops and the Norman kings had imposed upon the English church. So from the 11th, 12th century, when the Latinization of the English church began, as far as formally through the conquering after the Battle of Hastings, that was a repudiation of the true English heritage of King Alfred. And there were several English kings who called themselves, quote, the Vicar of Christ before the Pope used the term the Vicar of Christ. So for Cranmer, there was a sense in which that just as Constantine became Saint Constantine, the emperor of the church who calls its councils, who defends this holy bride, he saw Henry as serving a similar role, restoring not just Catholic history, but also a particular English version of Catholic history that goes back centuries. So for him to reform and to say we're no longer under the Pope is for him to reclaim an important and crucial part of his own English national identity and his historic identity. It's to return back to the Church of Alfred. And that's why English was so important to Henry and to Cranmer as well. Alfred takes the schools and requires the schools to speak in English. Alfred takes the churches and requires the priests to preach in English, because Alfred said that the renovation, the fighting back, the establishment of the English people will be through this type of thinking. And so that's exactly the same type of MO that Cranmer and Henry pick up. They're continuing their own English tradition, not something new, which is, again, which makes the whole claim that Henry VIII was a adulterous man who just throws off the yoke of the Pope because it's convenient, laughable, right? Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think these are important details that are lost, and I think they're lost because we're nearsighted on some of these things. And for Anglicans specifically, especially those that may be watching, this is why we learn our history. This is why we learn more views than one. The idea that we just go through and we read one side of history, that's what gets us in trouble. It appears to me that the See of Canterbury today, the problem is, so that leads us, so we've gone back from the apostles to Augustine all the way to Cranmer. Cranmer is hated for what he, but we today as Anglicans are benefiting greatly from the dedication of Cranmer. He was not a perfect guy by any stretch. But man, what he laid out that we still practice today is phenomenal. Now we look at the Church of England today. We see the condition that it's in. It has, and this is what's beautiful about the English history. From that point forward, the gospel really spread from England, especially in Africa. A lot of areas in New Zealand and Australia, the Church of England became a major port of sending out some of the greatest missionaries, songwriters, you name it, all the way through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And here we are, where the Church of England in its Anglican forms is bigger than what it is in England. You have major sized churches throughout here in the U.S., in Africa, a lot of Anglicanism in New Zealand, Australia, even in Southeast Asia. You're finding these, one of the biggest churches in the country of Malaysia, where we helped start a church and an apologetic network. One of the biggest churches there is an Anglican church. Anglicanism grew beyond the borders of England. Now we're at the Church of England, where Archbishop Welby is. His entire communion, just about more than 2/3, has called the See of Canterbury to repentance. And today there's almost a reformation happening, whether you call it the Global South, when you look at it as GAFCON, all these organizations, the Free Church of England standing up. We're finding that our roots have been completely taken over in a bad way. And we weep for the church in Canterbury, because of the things that are going on and being permitted, and it only seems to be progressively getting worse, not better. So, how do you view today? So, in light of, because this is where it gets into the your orders aren't valid, your orders aren't valid, your orders aren't valid discussion, and even the ACNA had to go through African bishops to receive valid rights. Many of the ACNA priests around here, their ordinations are through the different African bishops, specifically
Nigeria, Uganda. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And you know, and they're wonderful people in those churches as well. But when you go through and you look at today's church, the See of Canterbury today, it's heartbreaking knowing its history. But Anglicanism is different than it was in the Reformation because it's bigger beyond its borders. So how should we view the global South, the whole growing of GAFCON and all of its organizations with these different countries, which is bigger than the Church of England?
Yes.
How should we view what that is doing? Because obviously the Church of England says you guys are the dividers, you're the problem. Everybody on this side of it saying, no, you left orthodoxy. And so how do we view?
Yeah, there's a couple of answers there. You know,
Sure.
if somebody doubts the validity of Anglican orders in America today, there's no reason to doubt those. In addition to the claims made in the past centuries about utterly null and void, Anglicans have remedied our orders even from those claims through the infusion of Old Catholic orders. So, for example, myself, as an ordained priest, in my lineage, my apostolic succession goes back not only through the Church of England all the way to the apostles, but also after the First Vatican Council, which is 1860s-ish, those churches who broke from the Roman Catholic Church, the Nordic Catholics, the Polish National Catholics, those folks participated in the consecrations of bishops in the Anglican Church, therefore infusing Catholic orders upon them as well. So if the issue today is are Anglican orders valid, Rome needs to reapproach and rediscuss this, because from when they said utterly null and void, things have changed, and Rome hasn't ruled on that. Instead, they're trying to develop the Anglican ordinariate and instead say everything about Anglicanism is wonderful. It's prayer book, it's history, it's devotional patterns, it's saints, except we want it to be under us, while at the same time saying your priests are invalid.
Sure. They want their cake. They want their cake and they want to eat it.
Yes. If Anglicanism is so great, then if it's not great, why do you want it? If it is great, then what's the issue here? But so there should be no doubts in the minds of any Catholic-minded individual on the authority of Anglican orders today. Now, I'm a traditional Anglican. I believe that orders are only for presbyters who are male and
yes,
have moral state of grace, those type of things. Those are important as well. But as far as the future of Anglicanism, I think that Augustine offers us some insights there as well.
Okay.
We're not battling Anglo-Saxons, but we are battling pagans. And when pagans come in and they say God's institution of marriage is wrong, which of course did happen historically, when the pagans come in and they try to redefine these things, we need a united front against those. So what happened historically? In the 7th century, when the pagan hordes came in, the Celtic churches and the Roman churches banded together, infused their orders, and built a greater empire because of it. And the church was blessed from the 7th century all the way through the Reformation, where the battle was no longer between pagans and Christians, but amongst Christians itself. As sad as the tragedies, the deaths, the murders, the wars between Protestants and Catholics are, we should recognize that was between Christians and a land that was previously maybe not Christian. So the same type of perspective can be had today. The future of Christendom is more important than the future of my ecclesiological baseball team. I think it's more important to represent Christ crucified than to represent Team Ultramontane or Team Canterbury. Now, in the Anglican realignment movement, my bishop is Dr. Ray Sutton, who's head of the ecumenical relations with the ACNA. You'll see him he was with Bishop or Pope Benedict. He was with the Archbishop of Latvia a couple of weeks ago. He travels all around the world meeting with Orthodox and Roman Catholic and other apostolic bodies, because he recognizes and teaches us as priests that the battle of the next 50 years is not over who gets to claim the title, the Kreutzer, the cathedrals of Canterbury. The battle is, will there be any people to fill those cathedrals? Will Christendom survive this dearth of pagan onslaught today? And so my message to Catholics who would be critical of Orthodox or conservative Anglicans is, we're not your enemies. We represent a tradition that, for history's sake, is the same as yours. And our battle is for the future of Christendom in general. But realignment itself is not unique, again, to Anglicanism. If you go online today and you Google Pope Francis, you're going to find the same issues are being had in the German bishops.
Yes, very
debates
much.
over homosexuality. If you go in the United States, we have some very, very famous Catholic politicians. One who's close to me, his name's Gavin Newsom. His aunt, Nancy Pelosi, they're good friends with Joseph Biden. All of those are Catholic politicians who support the slaughter of the unborn children. How is that not a scandal to the Roman Catholic Church that these bishops can't punish, or I shouldn't say the word punish, can't excommunicate open heretics who are against Catholic social teaching? So as visible as what we see in the Episcopal Church today with pride flags and lesbian ministers and things are, the realignment issue that Anglicanism is facing is the same secular issue that the Roman Catholic Church is facing, the Eastern Orthodox Church is facing. All of them are surrounded by cultures who desperately need Christ, who need the gospel. And the Anglican Church has been for 2,000 years a faithful steward, defender, promulgator of that faith, and deserves the recognition for that, but will also be an important ally for the Roman Catholic Church in the future. And obviously, since the Oxford movement in the 1800s, there's been a revival and desire for the church to be one, and often at the emphasis of our Catholic ritual, of our Catholic patrimony, of recognition of saints in the history of the church. But all of those saints and all of that history all echo what our Lord says, that they might all be one. And so
John
the battle today is not whether or not we'll all be one under the Pope. The battle is, will there be any Christians remaining? And I find it hard to imagine that the Anglicanism won't play a major role in that in the future, based on how significant, whether it was the Irish monks at Iona, or it was Augustine at Canterbury, whether it was Columba or Columbanus, or any of these historical British figures leading up to the Reformation, were significant strides forward for Christendom. And you can't read the Reformation history without recognizing the contributions of the English-speaking Christians in the world, as you point out, to missionaries, but founding of seminaries, the King James Bible itself, the culture of Western civilization that came with that, the revival of classical learning. The United States itself, as a Anglican Puritan colony, wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the union of James and of Scotland under King James. It wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Charles I. It wouldn't exist without the imprint of Anglicanism on history. And that particular piece has been missed, that the last 500 years of world history have been dominated by the power of Anglicanism in the Western world, unlike any other country. And I think that's worth noting and considering, what is God doing through the Anglican Church that the world is willing to tear it apart. What is God doing to the Anglican Church? There is so much fruit coming from this simple prayer book tradition from a tiny little island with a few monks. So
That's very well said, Father. I mean, that is very well said, and it goes back to what you said earlier in the program. You made the comment that the church is always needing reformation. I mean, I look at so many problems, so many issues in our own church and diocese and things that make me angry. But it's like, you mentioned all these other churches that are dealing with their issues right now. All of Christ's church needs to be reforming, constantly changing, developing, repenting, restoration needs to be done. And we believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And we pray for that. We pray that the Lord would unify his church when we see nothing but division and brokenness. But we also realize that unity has to be around the truth. Can't be around something that's false. We can't buy into what the Archbishop of Canterbury is currently pushing and others with him. There has to be orthodox truth that the scripture has taught from the beginning. Our fathers before us in this line of history has defended and taught as well. We're a part of something bigger than ourselves, too big to let current society dictate to us what is true. And so I think with those things, all church movements need reforming, and all church movements are working on that. And the Anglican Church is growing. It's growing universally. It's growing here in the United States. It's growing in Africa, and it's actually it's exciting to see that God is doing something great, even in the middle of the communion having its major issues right now. That it's actually the major issues is motivating and pushing conservative Anglicans to rise up, make bold proclamations, to start churches, to plant and ordain more ministers. And it's actually created a better thing. So God's still working despite all the chaos. And we're not exempt from the problems because every generation had to deal with their problems. So
the chaos is usually evidence that God is working.
yes.
Two little quick notes on that. My favorite book of the Bible is Judges. Judges is the story of this man named Gideon. Gideon has a big army. God makes him wean it down, doesn't he? He makes it come down to 300 men.
300.
Why? Because he wanted evidence that it was God, not Gideon. And the same thing is happening in the Roman Church, so that it's proof that it's not the office of the Pope, but the faithfulness of the gospel. The same thing will happen in the Anglican Church. But it's also just historically how the church has functioned. I named my oldest son Athanasius because I wanted him to recognize the history of the church has been Athanasius contra mundum. It's even if every other bishop says you're wrong and excommunicates you more than once, more than twice, more than 3 times, the truth is still the truth, no matter what the vote or the tally on it. The conciliar nature of the church is not, let's see what the spirit of the age is. The conciliar nature of the church is what has the history of the church, the democracy of the dead, as G.K. Chesterton said, what has the church said historically? And we have to, when we vote on things, we have to raise all the hands. That means Aristobulus all the way in the 1st century, Athanasius, Basil, Ambrose, Augustine, all of them are raising their hands saying not only that the British church was autocephalous and valid, but they're also saying that these values that are under attack, marriage, life, real presence in the Eucharist, sanctity of worship and holiness, these things are worth fighting for. And we should expect that as they make progress and as we strive towards holiness, that the world will rage against those and cause division, dissension in the church. It wasn't just because it was the Arian controversy. It was because the Christology of the Nicene Church was so close to the truth that it caused a challenge to the church. And so when we see challenges, we should reinterpret them as opportunities for the truth to triumph and for God to be glorified, even though for us who are in the day-to-day speaking from the pulpit, struggle with that. So
Fantastic. All right, folks, we are I'm overwhelmed with the data and the information here that was spoken. There were so many good things of wisdom that were said at the conclusion of this. Father, we thank you for joining us. I mean, this was a special treat, and we're going to definitely keep tabs on the ministry that the Lord is doing there, and we're behind you, supporting you, and we're excited about the future of Anglicanism, and especially out there in California, and what the Lord is going to do in your parish as well as your diocese, and the continual relationships that are built within Anglican communion like ourselves. So thank you for joining the episode and taking time out of your day to do that. Any last suggestions or books to read or anything you want to shoot out to the audience before I put you behind stage and close out?
Yeah, well, obviously a good place if I'm interested in ecclesiastical history of England, read Bede. He's the simplest one. He's not perfect. He's working on Gildas's work, an older work, but read Bede. If you want a fuller picture of the Anglican view of church history, John Moorman, Moorman, is usually the text assigned in Anglican seminaries. At least it was here in the Reformed Episcopal Church at Cranmer House, the Reformed Episcopal Seminary. Moorman, his history of the English Church is wonderful. Those things are very helpful, but a conversation that is will continue to bear fruit, and I'm appreciative of the time you had for having kind of a historical anomaly, I guess, more than theological proper. So,
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining. I'll put you behind stage and close out with you in a minute. All right, folks, that's all we have time for. What a special treat. What a special guest that we had, and I enjoyed it. I'm going to go back and watch it myself, take notes. I hope you did as well. Thanks for those who contributed in the comments. Nobody got out of hand. That was good. But folks, again, if this is your first time watching and you're just being joined to Facts, we're fairly new. We haven't been around very long. Be sure to subscribe and like us here on YouTube, which we are very, very new on, just a couple of months. We do have a podcast that goes out. This will be on the podcast as well to those that are listening. It is on Spotify. It is on Podbean. It is on Google Podcasts. It is on Apple. It's on 7 different platforms for the podcast level, which is one of our biggest followings. We actually have a pretty big following on the podcast itself. If you're listening via podcast, make sure you subscribe and get new episodes as well. Well, folks, that's all we have time for. As always, grace and peace to you. God bless.